In 1944, amidst the chaos of World War II, German POWs arriving in Nebraska faced a shocking discovery. What they thought was the enemy looked eerily familiar, like family. It was a surreal moment. As these prisoners, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, were transported across the Nebraska plains, they expected nothing more than another harsh reminder of their defeat. They had been captured in the deserts of North Africa, far from home, but now they were being driven through fields of lush crops and farmhouses that looked, in many ways, like something they could have found back in their own homeland. The truck, carrying these men of the Afrika Korps, rattled along the dusty road. The air inside was thick with heat and the smell of sweat. The men, most of whom had fought under one of history's most respected military leaders, sat quietly, their eyes focused on the road ahead. The silence was heavy, but not just because of the fatigue from months of battle. It was something else, something far more unsettling. As they passed field after field of sugar beets, corn, and wheat rippling under the summer sun, something unexpected caught their attention. Names, German names, painted on the mailboxes in big, bold letters. Müller, Schneider, Kruger, names they recognized, names they had heard growing up in villages across Germany. The very people they were now being told to fight were, at least in some strange way, linked to them. One of the prisoners, a tall man with sunken cheeks, leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. He nudged the man sitting next to him and said in German, "Do you see that? Müller, Schneider, German names." The others craned their necks, peering through the gaps in the canvas. It was true. Every few miles, another German surname marked the entrance to a family farm. For the first time since their capture, the men weren't looking at America as a faceless enemy. They were looking at something eerily familiar. Imagine the disbelief. Imagine the shock of seeing your enemy, the one you've been taught to hate, with the same last names, the same traditions, and the same way of life that your family had. These men were prisoners of war, but in that moment, they weren't sure whether they were still at war or simply far from home. For the men in that truck, this was a moment of reckoning. How could it be that here, in the heart of America, they were seeing their own heritage reflected in the landscape? How could their enemies share the same names, the same traditions, and the same culture? The truck rumbled on, its wheels kicking up dust, but the men were no longer thinking about the long journey they had taken or the battles they had fought. They were thinking about home and how, in a strange twist of fate, it had followed them across the ocean. One man thought of his grandfather's farm in Württemberg, the scent of freshly cut hay, the sound of church bells on a quiet Sunday morning. Another thought of his father, walking alongside him through rows of sugar beets, just like the ones they were now passing. For a moment, they weren't soldiers, they were farm boys again. But the irony was painful. The farms, the names, the land, they were all so familiar. Yet, here they were, sitting under guard, forced to work for men and women who bore the same names as their own families. They had crossed oceans, fought battles, and yet here they were, laboring in a place that felt too much like home. It was as if the war had folded in on itself, blurring the line between enemy and kin. As the truck slowed, the prisoners looked out across the horizon. They saw farmers working in the fields, wearing overalls, their faces weathered by years of hard labor. A family stood near the fence, watching them pass. The father, his broad shoulders bent from years of toil, shielded his eyes against the sun. Beside him, his wife stood, and their young boy waved a baseball glove in his hand. For a brief moment, one of the prisoners raised his hand and waved back. The guard, sitting at the back of the truck with a rifle on his lap, didn't say anything. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even mercy. It was just a simple human gesture, a wave, a connection, a reminder that, despite everything, they were still men, still human. The truck turned onto a narrow farm road, and the men could hear the voices of the farmers calling out to each other in the distance. For the first time, they weren't prisoners. They weren't soldiers. They were simply men, looking at a world that, for a brief moment, felt like their own. And that was the hardest part of all. They had come here to fight, to destroy, and now they were forced to confront the truth. Their enemy was not so different from them after all. The truck bounced as it reached the farm's driveway. the dust swirling in thick clouds around the barn. The guards barked orders. The prisoners climbed down from the truck and began the day's work, their bodies sore from the long ride. The truck bounced as it reached the farm's driveway, the dust swirling in thick clouds around the barn. The guards barked orders. The prisoners climbed down from the truck and began the day's work, their bodies sore from the long ride. But the real work had already begun. Inside their minds, questions of loyalty, identity, and humanity collided in ways none of them had ever expected. As the men moved down the rows of crops, hoeing the weeds and thinning the plants, they couldn't stop thinking about the families they had left behind, the ones who had stayed in Germany, the ones who had fought with them, and the ones who had never known the horrors of war. How different were these farmers from their own people? Were they not all the same? Were they not all just men, working the land, trying to make a living? The questions lingered in their minds as they worked, the heat of the sun making their muscles ache, their hands blister. But it wasn't just the physical labor that was exhausting. It was the mental strain of reconciling what they had been taught to believe with what they now saw with their own eyes. For the first time, they began to wonder if they were fighting the wrong war. Was this what they had been sent to destroy? The same people who shared their names, their culture, and their heritage? And if so, how had it all gone so wrong? But it wasn't just the work that was strange. It was the land itself. This Nebraska soil felt too familiar. As they moved through the fields, the prisoners couldn't help but notice the subtle details. The way the crops grew in neat, perfect rows. The sound of the wind rustling through the wheat. The smell of fresh earth, so thick and rich that it made them pause for a moment, hands brushing the soil. Some of them even knelt down to feel it between their fingers. This wasn't just any land. It was good land. The kind of land they had known back home in Germany. It was the soil they had farmed, the fields they had toiled in before the war had taken them away. For a brief moment, it was easy to forget that they were prisoners. Here, they were just men, working the land. Their pasts, their uniforms, their weapons, they all seemed so far away. All that mattered now was the rhythmic pull of the hoe, the weight of the tools in their hands, and the work that had always been part of their lives. One of the prisoners, Hans, the baker's son, stood still for a moment, feeling the earth beneath his boots. He muttered to himself in German, "Good land, better than what we had back home." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a sense of wonder. Another, Wilhelm, a mechanic by trade, stood at the edge of the field, staring at the large American tractors pulling plows across the land. His eyes widened as he watched the machines at work. They were nothing like the small, rudimentary tractors he had seen in Germany. These machines were massive, efficient, and powerful. "They farm like an army," he whispered, half in awe, half in frustration. He could see it now, how America had the resources, the technology, the land to produce food on such a scale. They had everything they needed to keep fighting, while his country struggled to feed its own. The prisoners worked through the day, and as they did, more of these moments of reflection filled their minds. They saw the same barns, the same silos, the same farmhouses. The names on the mailboxes continued to haunt them, names they had heard since childhood, names like Müller, Schneider, and Kruger, names that had once been part of their own lives, part of their own family trees. They couldn't shake the feeling that, in some strange way, they had come full circle. What was happening here, in these fields, felt too much like home. The same names, the same traditions, the same way of life, but this wasn't home. This wasn't Germany. This was America, and they were supposed to be enemies. Yet the longer they worked, the more the line between enemy and neighbor blurred. It was as if the war, the reason they had been fighting, was slowly fading away. What had once been a clear division, us versus them, was now hard to see. Who were they really fighting for? Were these farmers really their enemies? Or were they just ordinary people, like their own families, caught up in something far beyond their control? At noon, they sat together for a break. The guards passed out cardboard boxes filled with sandwiches, fruit, and cartons of milk. For a moment, the prisoners hesitated. The food was more than they had seen in weeks. The bread was thick, the meat generous. In their home country, such luxuries were almost unheard of. They looked at the food in disbelief, not because they were ungrateful, but because it was so ordinary, so peaceful, so unlike the hunger they had endured in the deserts of Africa or the trenches of Europe. One of the prisoners, Dieter, slowly took a bite of his sandwich, savoring the taste. He glanced around at the others, his voice low as he muttered, "This isn't war food. This is comfort food." They all nodded. It felt strange. For a moment, it was as if the war had ended. They weren't prisoners. They weren't enemies. They were simply men, sitting in a field, eating lunch. The simplicity of it all, a break from the chaos that had consumed their lives for so long, was almost too much to bear. But just as quickly, the weight of reality came crashing back. They were still prisoners. They were still fighting a war, one that had taken them across oceans, through deserts, and into a strange land. And yet, here they were, working side by side with people who might have been their neighbors in another life. The land felt like home, but they couldn't stay in that moment forever. As the workday wore on, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the heat, it was the tension. The unspoken questions were building inside them. What did it all mean? Why were they here, working these fields? Could it be that they had been fighting the wrong people all along? Had their enemies been so different from them? The American farmers they worked for, could they have been their relatives in another time, another world? The questions were uncomfortable. They stirred doubts about loyalty, identity, and purpose. For many of the men, the answer was clear. They were soldiers. They had fought for their country, and they would fight again if given the chance. But there were others who weren't so sure. The harsh realities of war, the endless battles, the suffering. It was hard to keep believing in a cause that felt so distant, so empty. They knew what the propaganda had told them. They knew they were supposed to hate these people, to see them as the enemy. But as they worked these fields, side by side with the American farmers, they couldn't ignore the truth. These men weren't so different from them. They too had families, traditions, lives. The line between enemy and neighbor had never been more blurred. The men thought of their families back home in Germany, of the life they might have had if the war hadn't torn everything apart. And as they worked, the sun beating down on them, the land stretching endlessly before them, they couldn't help but wonder, what would life have been like if they had never left their farms, if they had never been caught up in this war? As the day wore on, the prisoners found themselves more and more lost in their own thoughts. Thoughts of home, of family, of the war they had fought, and the strange new life they were being forced to live. The sun hung low in the sky as the prisoners worked through the fields, each lost in their own personal reflections. It was hard not to think about their homes in Germany, where they had once been farmers, mechanics, bakers, men with families, with futures. Now they were men who had fought for their country, only to end up here, in a foreign land, working for people who shared their names, their bloodlines. It was hard to reconcile the man they had been with the man they had become. In their minds, they were still soldiers, fighting for the Reich, battling for something greater. But out here, in these fields, they were nothing more than workers. They were part of the land, like the crops they harvested, but they didn't belong. They never truly belonged. One man, Wilhelm, stared across the field at an American tractor as it worked its way through the rows of corn. He watched the machine move with precision, cutting through the crops effortlessly. He couldn't help but feel a sense of envy. In Germany, their tractors were smaller, less efficient. Here, in America, it seemed like everything was built to last, to work endlessly, without pause. America, they have everything, Wilhelm muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. Machines that don't stop. Fields that never end. They don't know the struggle we've seen. But there was no bitterness in his voice, just awe. And perhaps, deep down, a sense of resignation. They had fought with everything they had, only to be captured, only to be reduced to this, working the land, living under the watchful eyes of American guards, doing the very thing they had once done back home. As the prisoners continued their work, they couldn't stop thinking about the strange parallels between their lives here and the lives they had left behind. The American farmers, though they fought against their own people in the war, weren't so different from them. They too worked the soil, cared for their land, and lived by the same principles of hard work and perseverance. And yet, these same farmers were the ones the prisoners had been taught to hate, to destroy. It was a paradox that none of them had anticipated. The enemy, once faceless, now looked like the men they had fought beside. In the evenings, as the workday drew to a close, the prisoners returned to the barracks. The men, exhausted from a day of labor, sat together in silence. The guards stood watch, but there was little need for them. The prisoners weren't planning an escape. They weren't plotting any rebellion. They were too tired for that. All they could do was sit, reflect, and try to make sense of what had happened. The night brought a strange sense of stillness, the kind that settles in after a long day of work. The air was cool, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside the barracks was the only noise that broke the silence. Inside, the men sat around the crude wooden tables, their voices low, speaking only when necessary. They talked of home, of families, of their old lives. They reminisced about the days before the war, before everything had changed. The conversations were simple, but they carried weight. They spoke of the things they had lost: homes, families, innocence. One evening, Dieter, the young soldier, spoke up. His voice was clear, cutting through the quiet like a knife. "If this is the enemy," he said softly, "then why does it look so much like home?" For a moment, no one spoke. The words hung in the air, like a question that had been asked but couldn't be answered. Dieter's words lingered, slowly sinking into the minds of the others. They had all been wondering the same thing, but none of them had been brave enough to say it out loud. Now that Dieter had spoken, the truth seemed inescapable. What if the war wasn't just about who was right and who was wrong? What if it was about something much more complex? The prisoners spent many nights discussing this very question. Some of them, like Vogel, the older corporal with the scar on his cheek, clung to the idea that they were soldiers, fighting for the Reich. He spoke often about duty, about the loyalty to their country, about the honor of fighting for the fatherland. His words were harsh, filled with bitterness, but they resonated with some of the men. For them, the war wasn't over. It couldn't be. But for others, like Hans, the baker's son, the reality of their situation was harder to ignore. They were no longer soldiers. They were men who had been swept up in a war that had destroyed everything they knew. They had fought for a cause that seemed so far removed from the land they now worked on. It was a paradox that haunted them. They had crossed oceans, fought battles, and now they were here, working the fields of their so-called enemies. The men who had once been the enemy now shared the same land, the same names, the same traditions. What if they weren't so different from us after all? What if, in the end, the real enemy wasn't the person on the other side, but the war itself? It was a question none of them had answers to, but it was a question that would shape their journey in the days to come. As the work continued, as the seasons changed, the men would find themselves wrestling with these questions. They would come to realize that the true battle wasn't being fought on the battlefield. It was being fought within themselves. The men who had been captured and brought to Nebraska were no longer just prisoners of war. They were men struggling to understand who they were, who they had become, and who they might have been if the war had never started. The faces of their so-called enemies had become the faces of their neighbors, and the war, once so clear and defined, had become a blur, a confusion of names, places, and people that were all too familiar. Each day, the prisoners worked the land, but as the days turned into weeks, they began to feel the weight of something far more profound: questions of identity, loyalty, and the price of war. The rhythm of farm work had become their new routine. The long days under the sun, the repetitive tasks, the exhaustion, it all became a blur. But in the quiet moments, when the work slowed, the questions began to rise again. The air felt heavier, filled with doubts and reflections. They had been captured in a war that had torn apart their homes, their families, and now they were on foreign soil, working for men who, in so many ways, were not so different from their own families. In the evenings, as the sun sank low behind the hills and the prisoners trudged back to their barracks, the discussions grew more intense. What had it all been for? They had fought for a country that no longer seemed to stand for the ideals they had once believed in. They had marched into battle, believing in a cause, believing in victory. Now they were working the land, side by side with the very people they had been taught to hate. How could this be? How could the enemy look so much like them? Hans, the baker's son, had started talking more about his home, about his father's bakery in Stuttgart, and how he had once helped make bread for the village. It had been a peaceful life, simple and full of hard work. His family wasn't rich, but they had enough. The bread they made had been the bread of their community, shared by neighbors. Now, here he was, sitting in a barracks with men who had once been his enemies, but who were now, in some strange way, like family. The realization was hard to shake. Had the war torn them from everything they knew, only to bring them back here, to a place that felt too much like home? Then came the moments, the small gestures, that made them question everything they had been taught about the enemy. One afternoon, while working in the field, one of the prisoners, Dieter, felt something strange stir inside him. As he bent over to hoe the row of crops, a young boy, no older than 6 or 7, ran across the field, barefoot and full of energy. He was carrying a baseball glove, waving it around as he ran. The boy wasn't afraid of them, not in the slightest. He smiled, his face full of innocence, and waved his glove in Dieter's direction. Dieter froze for a moment, taken aback. It wasn't the kind of wave he expected from the enemy. It was the kind of wave a child might give to a neighbor, to a friend. Without thinking, Dieter raised his hand and waved back. It was a fleeting moment, but in that split second, something shifted inside him. For the first time since his capture, he didn't feel like a soldier. He didn't feel like an enemy. He felt human, like he was just another man, caught in the current of history, trying to survive. The moment passed quickly. The boy ran off, disappearing back into the safety of the farmhouse. Dieter stood there for a moment, still holding his hoe, his hand still raised in the air. It was an unexpected moment of connection, a simple, innocent gesture, and yet it had shaken him to the core. The questions continued to haunt them. Could they really call these people enemies? Could they still see themselves as warriors, as protectors of the Reich, when they were standing side by side with men who shared the same blood, the same history? As the weeks passed, the prisoners began to notice more and more of these moments of humanity. They began to see the farmers not as the enemy, but as ordinary people, people who, just like them, had been swept up in the tide of war. The farmers had their own struggles, their own challenges. They had families to feed, fields to tend, and homes to protect. But they weren't much different from the prisoners. They had their own dreams, their own lives, their own history. One day, as the prisoners were taking a break, a farmer named Heinrich Schultz approached them. He was an older man, with rough hands and a weathered face. He stopped in front of a young prisoner named Schneider, who was working alongside him in the field. Heinrich looked at Schneider, then at the name on the prisoner's roster, Schneider. He squinted his eyes for a moment, as if trying to make sense of it. Then, in slow, broken German, he spoke. Bist du aus Bayern? Are you from Bavaria? Schneider stiffened, unsure how to respond. He glanced at the guards, who were watching from a distance, but Heinrich was insistent. My family, too. From Würzburg, he said, tapping his chest with his calloused hand. We are not so far apart. Schneider was stunned. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't thought about before. He wasn't just working for an American farmer. He was working alongside someone who shared his heritage, someone whose family had come from the same place as his own. The division between them, once so clear, suddenly felt thinner, more fragile. The conversation lasted only a minute before the guards barked at everyone to get back to work. But for Schneider, the impact was lasting. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Was this what it had all been for? Was the war really about this? About men like him and Heinrich, separated by history, by borders, but still, in some way, the same? And so, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the prisoners found themselves caught in a world between two realities, the world of soldiers and the world of men. They were still prisoners. They still wore the same ragged uniforms, ate the same meager meals, and worked the fields under the watchful eyes of their guards. But their sense of identity had begun to shift. They were no longer just soldiers. They were men. Men who had once been farmers, fathers, sons. Men who had once been like the very people they now found themselves working for. They began to question everything: their loyalty, their past, their reasons for fighting. Was it possible that they had been wrong all along? Was it possible that the war, the hatred, the violence, it was all a mistake? The questions they had once tried to bury were now impossible to ignore. And as they worked these fields, side by side with their so-called enemies, they realized something they had never expected. The lines between soldier and farmer, between enemy and neighbor, were blurring, and as much as they tried to deny it, there was no escaping the truth. These were men like them. They were caught in a war that had torn them apart, but it was a war that was beginning to feel more and more senseless with every passing day. They had fought for the Reich, for a cause that now seemed so distant, so hollow, and now, here they were, working side by side with the very people they had been taught to hate. The war had made enemies of neighbors, but it was also making neighbors out of enemies. As the days passed, the hard labor of the fields became almost secondary to the deeper questions that lingered in their minds. For the prisoners, the real work had started inside their hearts and minds. With every sunrise, the prisoners found themselves drawn more into a quiet internal battle, one that had little to do with the crops they harvested or the soil they tilled. As the harsh Nebraska sun beat down on them, they could feel the weight of their thoughts pressing harder than the weight of the tools they carried. The questions, once buried deep, now surfaced like a flood. Why had they fought? Who were they fighting for? And, more importantly, who were they fighting against? The faces of the farmers, the ones they had once viewed as enemies, no longer looked so different from the faces of their own families. They had come here to break these people, to defeat them, but now they were working together. The more they worked alongside these so-called enemies, the more they began to see the shared humanity between them, and that realization was harder to bear than any battle wound. One evening, after a long day in the fields, as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, Hans stood outside the barracks, looking out over the vast expanse of land. The wind was still warm, and the smell of fresh-cut hay filled the air. He closed his eyes, letting the scent take him back home. For a moment, he wasn't a prisoner of war. He wasn't a soldier. He was a young man again, walking beside his father in the wheat fields of Germany. He could almost hear the distant sounds of church bells, the same bells that had once signaled the start of a new week. But then reality came rushing back. He wasn't at home. He was thousands of miles away from his family, caught in the web of a war he never truly understood. His father wasn't here. His family wasn't here. And the land beneath his feet wasn't his to claim anymore. He was no longer a farmer, a baker's son. He was just a man caught between two worlds, the world of war and the world of humanity. It wasn't just the land, or the food, or the names on the barns that made them question everything. It was the small, everyday moments that forced them to see the truth they had been avoiding. One afternoon, as the prisoners worked in the sugar beet fields, a woman came walking down the dirt path toward them. She was carrying a basket of water for the men working in the heat. The woman, a Nebraska farmer's wife, was wary at first. She had been told not to get too close to the prisoners, to keep her distance. But as she approached the field, she hesitated. There was something in her eyes, a softness, a hesitation. She set the basket down by the edge of the field and walked away, casting a nervous glance at the prisoners before leaving. But as she turned to leave, one of the prisoners, a young man named Dieter, caught her eye. He was tired, his body sore from the labor, but he saw something in her that he hadn't expected. There was no fear, no hatred in her eyes, just a quiet, uneasy recognition. Dieter, driven by something deep inside him, gave her a small, respectful nod. It wasn't much, just a simple gesture. But the woman paused, glancing back over her shoulder at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Two people from opposite sides of a brutal war, connected in an unexpected, fleeting way. She smiled faintly, before walking back to the farmhouse. But that smile stayed with Dieter long after she had gone. In that brief exchange, something fundamental shifted in Dieter. The enemy, once a faceless monolith, had become a human being, a neighbor, a person with fears, hopes, and dreams of her own. As the days stretched on, more of these quiet, unspoken moments continued to accumulate. The prisoners, who had once seen the farmers as the enemy, now saw them as just people, people who had their own struggles, their own lives, their own stories. It was no longer about uniforms, flags, or nationalities. It was about shared humanity, about the simple truths that connected them all. One morning, a farmer named Heinrich, who had been working alongside the prisoners for weeks, stopped for a break during lunch. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked over at one of the younger prisoners, a man named Ernst. Heinrich had learned a little bit of German over the years, enough to hold a basic conversation, and he gestured for Ernst to join him for a brief chat. Heinrich, in his thick German-accented English, asked, "Where are you from, Ernst?" Ernst hesitated, then replied, "Bremen." Heinrich smiled. "My grandfather came from there," he said. And for the first time, Ernst realized something that struck him deeply. This man, this American farmer, had a personal connection to the very place he had come from. In that moment, Ernst understood. The enemy he had fought for so long, the people he had been taught to hate, had stories just like his. They had families, histories, and roots in places he once knew. It wasn't the name of the country, the color of the uniform, or the flag that defined them. It was their shared humanity. But even with all the moments of connection, there was a truth they could no longer ignore. The war had changed them. They were no longer the men they had once been. They had arrived as soldiers, as warriors, fighting for a cause that seemed noble at the time. But now, after months of captivity, after living side by side with the people they had been taught to hate, they weren't so sure anymore. They had been molded by war, shaped by violence, and now they found themselves questioning everything they had ever believed. The prisoners were no longer just men in uniform. They were farmers, fathers, sons, and brothers. They were people who had been caught up in a war that had torn their world apart. And now, as they stood in the fields of Nebraska, surrounded by the same names, the same traditions, they couldn't help but wonder, what had it all been for? And so, as the war raged on beyond the barbed wire, the men who had once been enemies now found themselves on a journey that was as much about understanding each other as it was about understanding themselves. Each day, as they worked the land, they began to rebuild something inside themselves. It wasn't a country. It wasn't a flag. It wasn't the uniform they wore. It was a sense of humanity, of shared experience that began to define them. The war, the politics, the hatred, all of it seemed so distant now. What remained, as they worked side by side with the American farmers, was the realization that they weren't so different after all. As the truck carried them back to the camp each evening, the prisoners didn't just feel the weight of their fatigue. They felt the weight of a new understanding. They had crossed oceans, fought battles, and faced death. But in the end, it wasn't the enemy they had to defeat. It was the war itself, and perhaps, in some strange, unexpected way, they had already won. As the days turned into weeks, the questions they had once buried deep inside began to surface in quiet conversations, fleeting moments, and the simple acts of labor. Each day the prisoners worked the land. The once clear lines between enemy and neighbor continued to blur. The realization that they were, in fact, not so different from the farmers who had become their unlikely companions started to sink in deeper. They were still prisoners, still bound by the chains of war, their futures uncertain, but their view of the world around them had changed forever. During one of their regular breaks, Wilhelm, the mechanic who had been consumed by thoughts of machinery and the efficiency of American tractors, sat with Dieter and Hans. The work had become routine, the endless rows of crops stretching out before them like a never-ending canvas. But as they ate their simple meals, the conversation shifted. "I keep thinking," Wilhelm said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "If I had been born here, on a farm, in America, I might have had a life like these people, a different life." He paused, staring out across the fields, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would I have fought in this war if I had grown up like them?" Hans, the baker's son, looked at him, surprised by the depth of the question. He had never really considered it. Could he have been different? Could the war have been avoided if they had never been sent to fight someone who shared their bloodline, their heritage? "I don't know," Hans finally replied. "But these men, these farmers, they aren't what I thought. They're just people, aren't they? People who are just trying to make a living. Like we were, like our families were. Dieter, always quiet but perceptive, nodded slowly. We've spent so long fighting. But now, what are we fighting for? We fight for land, for pride, for honor. But for what? So we can work these fields and call them ours? These farms are just fields. They belong to no one and to everyone at the same time. The silence that followed was heavy. No one knew how to answer. The deeper they dug into their thoughts, the more questions surfaced, and the more the war seemed to lose its meaning. But even as they began to question their loyalties and identity, there were still moments that could not be ignored. Moments that made them realize how far the world had changed around them. One morning, as the prisoners worked the sugar beet fields, an unexpected sight caught their attention. A young American girl, no older than 8, appeared at the edge of the field. She was carrying a basket of water, looking out at them with innocent curiosity. For a moment, the prisoners froze. The sight of a child who was so oblivious to the war, to their presence, felt like a sudden break in the tension. She walked across the field, her little shoes kicking up dust as she moved. As she got closer, the prisoners noticed that she was smiling. With each step, her eyes locked onto theirs. She stopped when she reached them, offering the water to a young prisoner named Dieter. He was taken aback. It wasn't a hostile gesture. It wasn't a fearful one. It was just a simple act of kindness. Dieter hesitated for a moment, and then, without thinking, he took the water. "Thank you," he said quietly, in broken English. The girl smiled even more, as if she had just performed the most natural act in the world. She waved her hand and darted back toward the farmhouse, leaving behind nothing but a strange warmth that lingered in the air. The other prisoners stood still, watching her go, each lost in their own thoughts. For some of them, it was the first time they had experienced such simple humanity in this foreign land. They had been at war, fighting soldiers, and now here was this child, a small, innocent being, showing them nothing but kindness. In that one brief moment, the complexity of their situation hit them. The lines of war, the hatred, the propaganda, the political agendas seemed so distant in comparison to this. But as the days passed, the emotional weight of these moments began to build, leaving them more uncertain than ever about the road they had traveled and the one they still had ahead. That night, as the prisoners gathered in their barracks, there was an unusual stillness among them. Usually, the men would talk in low voices, discussing everything from their experiences in the war to what they hoped for when it was all over. But tonight, the air was thick with silence. The questions that had been building inside them had reached a boiling point. Their identity, their loyalty, their purpose, everything felt like it was slipping through their fingers. Dieter, unable to shake the unease in his chest, broke the silence. "What's the point of all this?" he asked, his voice raw, his tone searching for answers that didn't come. "We were sent here to fight, to destroy. But now we're working alongside the very people we were supposed to fight." A long pause followed his words, the men turning their eyes toward the walls of the barracks, toward the windows that showed a world they had never truly understood. Outside, the wind howled across the plains. Inside, their hearts were heavy. "I don't know," Hans finally responded, his voice low. "I don't know what any of this means anymore. I thought we were fighting for something. Honor, duty, country. But now, I wonder if it was all just a lie. If we've been fighting the wrong people all along." It was a question that lingered in the air, unanswered. No one knew what to say. How could they? They had been trained to believe that their cause was just, that the enemy was the enemy. But now, standing here, side by side with men and women who looked so much like their own families, it all seemed so pointless. In those quiet moments, the prisoners began to see the war not as a distant conflict, but as a reflection of the deeper struggle within themselves. For some of them, the war had been clear-cut, a fight for survival, a fight for victory. But now, as they worked these fields, the boundaries of right and wrong had become blurred. The farmers they had once seen as the enemy were no longer strangers. They were neighbors. They were human beings, just like them. And in that realization, the prisoners began to question everything they had once believed in. The realization wasn't easy to accept. It was uncomfortable. It made them question the very fabric of who they were, who they had become, and it made them wonder, if they had been born in this land, in this peaceful place, would they have ever fought in this war? Would they have been on the other side of the gun? The war, once so simple, was now a complex web of humanity, with no clear lines, no clear answers. The prisoners could feel the weight of it, pressing down on them as they worked side by side with the very people they had once been taught to destroy. The work continued, but for the prisoners, each day brought them closer to an undeniable truth. The war they had fought, the enemies they had once seen as so different, were now reflections of their own lives, their own past. As the days wore on, the Nebraska fields no longer felt foreign. The land, the names on the barns, the lives of the farmers, they had all become too familiar. The lines between enemy and neighbor, soldier and civilian, blurred beyond recognition. The realization weighed heavily on them. How could they have fought so fiercely against people who shared their heritage, their traditions, their blood? One by one, the prisoners began to accept something they hadn't been prepared for. The enemy wasn't always a stranger. Sometimes, the enemy was a reflection of what they had lost, of the lives they might have lived if they had been born on the other side of the ocean. The small acts of kindness from the farmers, an offered wave, a shared smile, slowly began to chip away at the walls of hatred they had built around themselves. And in those fleeting moments, they felt a connection, a bond that was impossible to ignore. These weren't just their captors. These were people who had once been like them, people who had worked the land, raised families, and fought to survive in their own way. And then came the day when the war finally ended. The news of Germany's surrender reached Fort Robinson, and the prisoners, who had once fought with such conviction, found themselves facing a world that had shifted irreversibly. The gates of the camp opened, and the prisoners, now more men than soldiers, were sent back to Germany. The land they had once fought for was gone, and in its place was a new world, one that was still healing from the devastation of war. They returned home, but home was no longer what it had been. The streets they had walked as children were in ruins. The people they had once known were scattered, lost to time and conflict. And yet, some of them would carry a part of Nebraska with them forever. The memory of the land, the faces, the names that had made them question everything. For the farmers who had worked beside them, the memory of the German prisoners would never truly fade either. Some of them wrote letters to the men who had once labored in their fields, thanking them for their work, for their dignity. Some even found themselves missing the prisoners, missing the strange moments of connection, of humanity that had broken through the barriers of war. In the end, the prisoners learned that the most lasting scars of war were not the ones left on the body, but the ones left on the soul. The fields of Nebraska had shown them something that had taken years of war to obscure. The truth that no matter how far apart we may seem, we are all bound by the same human experience. The names on the mailboxes, the faces in the fields, the small gestures of kindness. These were the things that lasted. These were the things that reminded them, in the end, that enemies are not always strangers. Sometimes, they are just reflections of ourselves, of the lives we might have lived if history had unfolded differently. As the prisoners made their way back to Germany, they carried these lessons with them, lessons that could not be erased by bombs or borders. They had been soldiers, yes, but now they were something more, men who had seen the enemy, not as monsters, but as people, just like them. And so, as the war ended, they returned to a world that had been forever changed. But the lessons they had learned in those quiet fields of Nebraska would stay with them for the rest of their lives. For some, it would take years to fully understand the impact of that time, how it had shaped their thoughts, their beliefs, and their futures. But for all of them, the memory of the German names on the mailboxes, the waves from the children, the simple acts of kindness, they would stay with them forever. The war may have ended, but the journey of understanding, of reconciliation, had just begun.